All right, it's time for us to get started. We're going to be in Matthew 16 and hopefully 17 and 18 today. Do we have anybody? All right. You want to go ahead, Aaron? All right. Aaron just volunteered himself to lead us in prayer.
If you'll bow with me. Our God and Father in heaven, we thank you for all that you've given us. Thank you for this time that we have to study your word. Thank you for the changing seasons that let us know that you are still the God of this earth, that you are still in control. Father, help us to surrender our wills to you so that we may be reminded that we are not the authors of our own life and salvation, but that you are. Help us to read and understand your word, to know you, Father, and not just the words that it says on the page. Let us come to know you. Be our God, and let us be your people. We ask these things in the name of your Son. Amen.
Amen. All right, so there is a lot in these three chapters, Matthew 16 to 18. I know that part of it we won't get to, but I want to catch what I think are the most significant things here. I am wanting to draw your attention to certain threads in the text. I don't know. I know this is class number 8. So we've been in this for a while. And what happens when you have class number 8 is that over the 2 months that we've been in the class, everybody loses their little notebook, right? So if you still have your notebook, I want to ask you text question number 1. And those who don't have a notebook, it's okay. You can participate too. Okay, but let's just throw out in these chapters, these 3 chapters, give me the examples of all the times that the disciples of Jesus are confused, wrong, unsure, or insufficient for their task. Go. Who's the greatest in the kingdom? All right, chapter 18, they're arguing about who's the greatest, right? And Jesus has to rebuke that. Okay, beware the leaven of the Pharisees. So first, Jesus says that, and then they say, oh no, he's getting on to us because we didn't bring any bread. And then Jesus, I picture him in an almost pull out your hair kind of moment where he says, don't you understand? I'm not worried about bread. If I need bread, I can make bread. Like we just did the whole thing with the bread, right? So they're missing Jesus in that scene. What else?
Jesus told him that he's going to die, and Peter says, no, that can't.
Right. So Peter has a great confession. You're the Messiah. And Jesus says, great job, Peter. You're exactly right. Now I'm going to go die. And Peter says, oh, no, that will never happen to you. Far be it from you. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. So not Peter's, yes, Peter's finest moment, and then yes, Peter's not so finest moment. Okay, what else? Dion? Right, so you got Peter walking on the water. It's the same pattern, right? Do something great, and then do something that's a little less great. What else in this section? Go ahead, Miss Peggy. To draw out the demons, right. In chapter 17, they come down from the Mount of Transfiguration, and they're trying to cast out a demon. They can't do it. And in fact, the guy whose son it is kind of, your disciples can't do this. I thought you were their teacher. You know, it kind of reflects on Jesus, but they're insufficient for the task. Yeah. Right. In fact, some of the other accounts say Peter didn't know what to say, and so he says, let's make 3 tents. And then also, you know, they're confused as to what's the deal with Elijah. So there's a lot going on there where they don't really know what's happening. It seems like it's all happening a little too fast for them, right? Jacob?
What defiles a person when he's explaining to them what really truly defiles a person, they need that explanation on that parable. And he's going to repeat some saying, do you not already understand?
Right. You should be further along than you are, especially that the time idea. Don't you get it yet? Okay? You're not with me. You're not understanding me. All right? Yes, ma'am. Right. Peter, in Matthew 17, they ask Peter about the temple tax. Does your master pay the temple tax? And Peter says, yes. And he's like, right, Jesus? Right? Don't we? You know, so, and of course, he's a little confused as to all of that, and Jesus has to explain why he pays the temple tax. It's not because he needs to. All right. I've got, forgiveness. And so what's the first question Peter asks? How many times? Up to 7 times, which I'm sure he thinks is incredibly generous. That is a lot, right? Forgive somebody 7 times. But Jesus says, no, 70 times 7. Let's see, what else do I have? And several times, you'll notice this for the rest of Matthew. Whenever Jesus talks about his crucifixion that's to come, the disciples always have an odd reaction. Sometimes they're confused. It says here that they are distressed. Peter rebukes him. They don't know what to do with that because it's not at all what they were planning or hoping. Okay, so just imagine, you've got, let's say you're a football fan. You've got a team that you think is going to be great. Okay, and so here comes the coach and he says, hey, great news, guys. We're going to lose all our games this season. Like, wouldn't you kind of say, what was that about? Maybe I just misheard him, or maybe we just got a bad quote. What's the context there? You wouldn't say, great, let's go lose them all. But that's kind of what the I'm about to die message is. They think we're going to go have a kingdom and we're going to go have a battle. Jesus is saying, no, we're going to go die. And after that, there's going to be more God's going to do to establish the kingdom. So there is some confusion, distress in that. Peter is not hesitant to rebuke Jesus, which is an interesting wrinkle on his faith. All right, so I say that to say there's a lot here where Jesus is on a different wavelength than the disciples, and that Jesus is trying to press them toward that. But really, they're not going to get on Jesus' wavelength until after his death. So I want us to notice that disconnect because that's the only way some of the things that we're going to see can be explained. Okay, so let's look at chapter 16. Let's talk a little bit about some of these that you guys have already addressed. The leaven of the Sadducees, the Pharisees and Sadducees. So what happens to initiate this is in verse 1, they come to him and test him to asking them to show him a sign from heaven. All right, so this is sort of a prove it kind of moment, and they're testing him to see, can you perform a sign on command? Show me something. And I know I've often heard it said, how many signs does he have to do to satisfy them? This is, in my view, more of a forensic type thing. Show us now in this setting here, and we'll believe you. It's put up or shut up time. Because all the things we've heard you did, we want to see them for ourselves. And Jesus is frustrated with that spirit. And the answer he gives is a little odd. Look at verse 2. When it's evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. In the morning, it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. So he left them and departed. All right, so the deal with the weather is just, you know how to read the sky, and you can figure out things in a worldly sense. How can you not see that what's happening here means God is acting, and that a lot of the things that God told you he would do are coming to pass? How can you miss that? And instead say, you know what, I'm going to wait and reserve judgment until I see more. He says you wouldn't do that with your natural things like the weather. So why are you doing that with me? How do you not discern this? And then he criticizes the generation, which he does this frequently, especially back in chapter 12. An evil and an adulterous generation seeks a sign, and I'm not going to give you a sign, except one sign, which he's already talked about, the sign of Jonah. But it seems to me like after this scene, Jesus is maybe a little rattled and kind of contemplative as they're going to the other side. And because in verse 6, he kind of brings it up again. Watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So he's kind of thinking about what just happened and who these people are and what's going on in their hearts and how they're missing things. And this spirit that's never really satisfied, it always says, show me more, show me more, show me more, like testing God, it described in the wilderness wanderings. So that's where the disciples miss him. Verse 7, they began discussing it among themselves, saying, we brought no bread. Oh no, Jesus is getting on to us because we're not very good at trip planning, and we didn't bring any food, and now we're all going to be hungry. And so Verse 8, Jesus, aware of this, said, "O you of little faith, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets you gathered, or the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets you gathered? How is it that you fail to understand that I did not speak about bread? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Okay, so you get the idea. And in fact, I love how Jesus, like a good preacher, repeats the lesson again at the end, almost like he's yelling now. Beware of the leaven. Okay, get it. I'm not talking about bread. You ready? Beware of the leaven. So finally they understand after he kind of gets on to them. Just an aside, this is very common as a reaction to Jesus. Especially it's highlighted in the Gospel of John. How many times in the Gospel of John does Jesus say something and everyone takes him physically and literally? You must be born again. How can I go back into my mother's womb and be born again? Taking him extremely literally, right? Okay. Or he tells the woman at the well, I could give you the living water. Oh, that would be so great. I wouldn't have to carry my jar, carry all the water all that way, which, that would be heavy, right? But she's missing him. Or I'm the bread of life. Eat my flesh, drink my blood. Oh, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? Oh, gross. Everybody seems to take him on this literal level, and Jesus is far above that. And so there is a disconnect there. You see that with even his disciples here. I think that eventually the disciples must have learned maybe he's not being literal. Maybe we need to think a little deeper that Jesus is not just throwing out weird sayings all the time to make us upset or to confuse us or to get on to us about our trip planning. So what is he saying? He is saying, in my judgment, criticizing this spirit of testing, always wondering and never making a decision, never coming to faith, but always sort of reserving judgment. If I see more, then maybe I'll believe. And other Gospels point out that this is about the hypocrisy of the Pharisees and Sadducees. I even think there's hypocrisy in that position that says we're the judges of Israel, and we're the ones who decide who's right and wrong, and yet we're not going to make a decision about that. Remember, they kind of did the same thing with John the Baptist. Let's hold him at arm's length. We'll go investigate him, and we'll say, who do you say you are? But we're not really going to believe in him. And we're not really going to give our lives over to the message. We're just going to sort of reserve judgment. So I think he is saying, watch out for that. And don't think that because these people are respected, that this is the way you should be as my disciples. Okay, let's talk about this section with the good confession. I hope you know that what we're about to read is extremely significant, sort of a high point in the gospel. We've been building to a lot of this as Matthew has shown us different times where the disciples are asking, who can this be? And what do we do with this guy? What are we thinking about him? And so now Jesus asks them straight out. Verse 13, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He said to them, but who do you say that I am? Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. Okay, so first, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And 14, they give a lot of weird answers because these people are all dead. So everybody's saying you're John the Baptist, you're Elijah, you're Jeremiah. I also think they edit the list because that's not all that people were saying about Jesus. Some of them were saying not so nice things like you're a servant of Satan, that sort of thing. But this is the nice list, and this is the good stuff. And there was some belief in the Judaism of this time that basically because of Malachi's prophecy about Elijah coming first, that maybe some of the old prophets would come to life again during the age of the Messiah. And so there's some thought of that maybe they're seeing some aspect of that coming to pass in Jesus. I love the question in verse 15. But who do you say that I am? I love it because it's so personal. Yeah, I hear what everybody else is saying. What do you say? And he puts them on the spot. Because there is a sense in which we could kind of go along with the crowd and kind of think our own thoughts and reserve judgment. But Jesus is saying, I'm putting you on record. What do you say? What do you think about me? What can you say? If they're not sure, you kind of give them, I don't know, maybe a prophet. I think you're a pretty cool guy. Do some stuff nobody else can do. What do you say? And so Peter answers, and the other Gospels make it clear that he's answering for the others, that the others agree with Peter's assessment. I'm sure they talked about it, because I think they did a lot of talking amongst themselves. But Peter answers in verse 16, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." All right, Jesus commends that, verse 17, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." So this is not something that you learn from people. This is something that is a revelation from God. You've come to understand this, and that's a gift of God's revelation. Jesus has said this already back in chapter 11. No one knows the Father except the Son, and no one knows the Father except the one to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. So in this way, they have understood and had the revelation that has come from God, not from man. All right, verse 18. Let's talk about this for a minute. "I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." So the significant part of this verse is that I will build my church. My church, my people, I will build my group. They will belong to me. And then the word a church here means an assembly or a gathering of people. I will build them. They will be mine. I'm collecting people. I think at this stage, you're probably thinking about the disciples, the entourage of Jesus. They are my church. But there's also a future sense to it, right? I will build. So I'm going to do something in the future that's going to involve Peter directly and whatever we decide this rock means. The gates of hell in verse 18 is a poor translation. The word hell is not the word hell, it's the word Hades. And Hades is death. And so very often, this is a legacy of the King James translation, which translated a lot of the Hades terms as hell instead of death. So the idea here is not something about Satan. The idea here is something about death. And so I believe the sense of the text is that Jesus is going to build a people and death won't be able to touch them. They will continue to be his through death. So Jesus is saying something about what Peter has said and the faith that Peter has expressed is going to unite people under Jesus. They will belong to him and death won't touch them. All right, I want to talk a little bit on this rock at the risk of causing a firestorm. I just want you to know that I understand that what I'm about to say is controversial. You probably are aware of the fact that this passage is used by the Catholic Church to justify the papacy. And they say that because Peter is addressed, "On this rock I will build my church," they believe that means Peter is going to be sort of the foundation of the church. He'll be the head of the church. And from that, they do a lot more to construct the papacy from this verse. So it's made the verse a battleground, and especially during the Protestant Reformation, there was a lot of talk about what's the rock. I will say, I believe that the rock here, because of the wording of the text, I believe the rock is Peter. But I am not saying that I think Peter was a pope. I don't believe there is a pope, and I don't believe that idea in the New Testament at all. But because of the way the text is worded, in verse 18, "I tell you, you are Peter." And I don't understand why he would say that. You are Peter. And on your confession, I'll build my church. Doesn't make sense to me. You are Peter means there's something going on that has to do with Peter. Now, you may be aware that Peter, the word for Peter in Greek, Petros, and the word for rock in Greek, Petra, are very closely, they can be taken as a pun, as the kind of a word play like teachers, Jewish teachers often did, and biblical writers often did. I do think that's what Jesus is doing here. You're Peter, and on you I'll build my church. So what does he mean in my interpretation? He means not that Peter's a pope, but Peter's going to be the one who is going to be the first to preach the gospel on Pentecost. Peter's going to be the one who's the first to go to the Gentiles in Cornelius' house. Peter's going to be the one who is sort of a spokesman for the group. He is that here. He is that in the book of Acts. But he's not over the others. He's just sort of the first. So I think that's what Jesus is alluding to. So please hear what I'm saying and what I'm not. I'm not saying anything about the Pope. I'm just saying something about this text, and that's the plain reading of the text to me. Now, I do not deny, I don't even argue with the fact that the confession is the significant part of what happens here in verse 16. The confession, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And that without that confession, there's no uniting factor that brings the church together. And I'm always open to the fact that I am wrong, but I have to kind of say that's the way the text leans to me in a natural reading. So I try to read things like this and like take out of it the picture that there might be a Catholic church and that there might be all these other people that have intervened in history between now and then, and just think about what was Jesus meaning. And I think Jesus was meaning, Peter, you're going to do some things that are going to be a part of me building my people. And because of that, I don't think it means more than that about Peter and his role. So I realize I've pulled a pin on a grenade and thrown it out there into the audience. I'm happy for you to respond to me. I know that probably very few of you agree with me about that, and I am comfortable with that. But I'm teaching right now, and so I have to kind of teach it the way I think it should read. So thoughts on that, Brother Dick?
At the risk of adding to the firestorm, places like Ephesians 2 speak of the apostles and prophets being a foundation. An understanding of Petra and Petros can be useful if I were to envision that the Petros bedrock is a makeup of all the little Petra that bind together to make up the Petros.
Right.
Peter being an excellent example
Right.
of what those are, apostles and prophets,
Right.
that the church is built on, that we are pillars in, Christians are pillars in God's makeup of a house. There's some really interesting vision that can spin off of this that helps me have an appreciation for it far beyond Peter being a single representative of all of the church.
Right. Right. I absolutely agree. And I think the reason the apostles and prophets become the bedrock is because they're the ones God used to reveal the message and to be sort of the first leaders, but not because they're above other people. In fact, they're going to try to argue about that in chapter 18, and Jesus says, no, you have to be like a little child, not trying to be better than each other. I don't think anything in here is about rank as much as it is about these are the people God used, and God used them in a powerful way, and now we sort of stand on their shoulders because without their message, we would have nothing. So I think Peter is one of those, but he's just one. He just happens to be the one who opens his mouth here. Right. Christ is the cornerstone. He's the one we can't do without. Right. Aaron? Oh. Dion?
So, Jacob, I agree with you too. But I also like the point, the gates of Hades will not overcome it. So to me, what does it mean, the gates of Hades? And who is represented there versus who is represented by what Christ is setting here? These are the first. These are the ones that are stretching to be the first ones to get the gift of eternal salvation, I guess is what I read into this. The gates of Hades represents the unjust dead. So life versus eternal damnation is what I read for this.
Right. Life and death, these are people who death won't touch because they belong to Jesus. Yeah. Aaron?
Well, rock is used in a lot of senses in the Gospels. Jesus talks about the building your house on the rock. And the foundation, he talks about the cornerstone. There's a lot of stone imagery in there. And so he's building on, I think, a lot of that when he's talking to Peter. He's saying, you're Peter, and on you and your faith, and the faith of the people that you're representing by this statement. And then later on, Paul is going to say, be an imitator of me, even as I am an imitator of Christ. He's not saying necessarily that, oh, well, we've got to act like Paul instead of acting like Jesus. But he's saying there's a human example of what you can be like.
Right.
And I think Jesus is doing the exact same thing here. He's saying, look, you are now the human examples of what I want my church to be like, and this bedrock foundation of faith.
Right. I think that's important. That's a significant thing to say, these are my people. And you guys are representative of that in a way. You are my people. I would just say we have a tendency to glorify people. And I think that's how this passage has been interpreted historically. We see Peter and we say, wow, Peter. But the Bible shows him as just a regular guy with all his flaws. We're going to talk about that in the sermon too, because Peter made some really big mistakes. And yet God was able to use him. And that's more about God than it is about Peter. So I don't think that Jesus is singling Peter out so that we could say, hey, Peter's the best. He has that opportunity in chapter 18, which hopefully we'll get to in a minute. I'm not sure because I introduced all of this. But in chapter 18, who's the greatest in the kingdom? They ask him. And if Peter is the answer, it's a great opportunity, right? Peter, come on up to the front of the line. Here he is, greatest in the kingdom. That's not the way the kingdom works, and that's not what God is going for here. So these are the people that God is going to use to initiate the project. And they are, because of that, close to Jesus and living examples of some things that God wants to do, but they're not perfect men. And even the Scripture is going to show us that. Shannon?
I appreciate that you brought out this different perspective because it's one that I haven't heard before. And I don't necessarily disagree with you. The only point that I was going to bring up is that if he is referencing Peter, which I think is a very good possibility, that he's referring to Peter based on what Peter just said. So even if there's a difference of opinion on, well, is it Peter or is it what Peter just said? There's really not much difference between the two perspectives. And because he's saying it's because of what you just said.
That's why you're blessed. Yes.
Yes. If he's referencing Peter and why is it because of what he just said? Well, because God revealed it to you. And if he's saying it based on what Peter is going to say in the future, again, that's because of what the Holy Spirit has revealed to him and will further reveal to him. So it's all kind of the same anyway. So,
I agree.
But I really like that you brought that up.
I agree. I think it's the same. It doesn't fundamentally change anything I believe. It just changes how I read the text. And so because it's been such a flashpoint, that's just kind of where I end up with it. All right. I'm sorry, guys. I think I got to move on. I know I've got other hands, and I know there's more to say, and I know there is the majority opinion, I'm sure, is this is the confession, and I'm fine with that. I think we all agree on that. I just think it's, for me, when I'm teaching that's the way I naturally read it. So we can all be friends and move on. All right. The other part, verse 19, is extremely important. Verse 19 says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again, I say we kind of tend toward glorifying men, and so there's a way to read this text that says, oh, look, Peter now has authority to, do whatever he wants, to decide, you know what, I don't like you, you're out. I bound it on earth, and now God will back me up. Peter doesn't act that way, by the way, for the rest of the record of the New Testament. Nobody acts that way. I don't think anyone could possibly construe the actions of the apostles to mean that this is giving them what we might call legislative authority. We get to decide for God. I think something else is happening here. I believe some of it may be in the verb tenses. My version has instead of shall be loosed or shall be bound, shall have been loosed, which is one of those, makes you want to go back to English class, the future, past, pluperfect or something, where the idea is God has decided things and now he's revealed them to man, and what man does on earth, what the apostles decide, teach, now is reflective of what happens in heaven. I think that's closer to the meaning. To me, what's significant about this is Jesus is saying, I'm going to use you, Peter. I'm going to use you, apostles, to show people how to get into the kingdom. Keys to the kingdom is an authority thing in the sense that you open the kingdom. And Peter is literally going to do that when he invites people into the kingdom in Acts chapter 2. Like, that's just the way that people are going to hear about Jesus and how to be saved. So I think that's significant. Turn over to Matthew 18. We have to tie this in. In Matthew 18, we'll jump in the middle in verse 17 where we're talking about somebody who's sinned, and then everybody kind of goes to him and tries to talk to him, and he won't change. And it says in Matthew 18:17, if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again I say to you, if two of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am among them. So there is a temptation to read that one too as a church thing, that, when we decide somebody's not living right and we say, he's going to be a heathen and a tax collector to us, there's a temptation to say, well, you know what? God is just saying, hey, you guys decided it. I have to do it. As if the church has legislative authority. And you can see in verse 19, you can read that way. If 2 or 3 agree about anything they ask, it will be done for them. Like, God has to do it. So, these sound like blank check kind of statements. And I think it's very, very dangerous to read them that way. The church doesn't have authority in itself. We're just people. We only have any standing before God on the basis of what God has given us and how we follow him. But he is saying something. To me, it is the close connection between Jesus and his people. He is saying, your voice will be heard by God as you hear God's voice. So, you hear, you listen, you obey, and you try to live out what God has bound, and you try to talk to other people about it, and God also hears you. And so you are working in concert with God. And I think these verses about the keys to the kingdom and these verses about binding and loosing all speak to the close bond between God and his people without saying, we somehow have our own authority on our own. Okay, let's go back to chapter 16. So just briefly, there's some significant things that happen here. We've talked about already, Peter rebukes Jesus after this in verse 22 because he doesn't think, after Jesus tells him that he's going to suffer and be killed and be raised, Peter doesn't think that's fitting of the Messiah. And so far be it from you, Lord. Peter's rebukes of Jesus often have this tone, like when he is washing feet and Peter thinks, this is beneath you. You'll never wash my feet. Here's the same thing. Far be it from you. This will never happen to you. And I think maybe Peter is thinking, I'll never let this happen. I would fight and die before I let anybody kill Jesus or crucify him. So don't even worry about that, Jesus. I've got you. But Jesus says in verse 23, get behind me, Satan, for you are a hindrance to me. You're not setting your mind on the things of God, but the things of man. Isn't that a quick turnaround? Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father. Now you're not thinking about heavenly things, you're thinking about earthly things. So this is a significant shift. I also think it's significant that Jesus says, you're a hindrance to me and you are Satan to me. Sometimes we can be Satan to each other when we are tempting each other or even talking in ways that discourage each other from doing what God wants us to do. So if Peter can do it, we can do it too. So Jesus invites, verse 24, he invites them to come after him, deny themselves, take up their cross and follow me. This can be taken very literally. Take up your cross. I'm going to go die. Come with me. Come die with me. This is what is the call of discipleship. All right. Boy, there's so much here that we're just going to have to jump over. Verse 28 is extremely significant. There's some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And, I mean, whole volumes have been written about this verse and this idea. We're going to have to save some of that for when we get to Matthew 24. But let's just say there's more to say about that. We'll have to come back to it later. We need to talk about the transfiguration. Chapter 17. They go up on the mountain. Verse 3 says, Moses and Elijah appeared talking with them. Peter doesn't know what to say, and so he says, hey, let's make 3 tents. Why are they making tents? I assume it's to do some kind of worship, homage. Tabernacle was a place of worship. So something is like going on in of that nature because Peter doesn't know what to say. And while he is talking, it says in verse 5, a voice came from the cloud saying, this is my beloved son with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him. I don't know that this is, I know that there's a lot of mystery as to the transfiguration, how Jesus is transformed, how we've got people who are dead appearing. But I don't think the lesson is hard to gather. The lesson is, even when you have Moses and Elijah there present with Jesus, who does God want us to listen to? Jesus. Pretty emphatic, right? In fact, it's almost as if Peter is saying, hey, we should listen to all of these guys, right? And God says, no. Listen to my son. This is my son. So if you take that to be sort of typological, where you would say, here's Moses as a representative of law, and here's Elijah as representative of prophets, which, is the basic division of the Old Testament. Of course, there's more in the wisdom or writings part. But law and prophets versus Jesus, and here Jesus sort of supersedes all of that. I think there is something to that, and the disciples are taught this is how you need to think. You need to think of Jesus above the others. Let's get to chapter 18 and talk about who is the greatest. We're jumping over them not being able to cast out the demon and the story about the temple tax that we talked about earlier. In chapter 18, by the way, it all reads like it's about community. So Jesus introduced the idea in chapter 16 of the church, the group of people who were disciples of Jesus working together, living together, and not being subject to death together. Here it's a lot more practical because before we get to all of that, what's going to happen, right now they're fighting about who is the greatest. So they ask him, verse 1, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And calling to him a child, he put him in the midst of them and said, truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So I do want us to notice that this is a great opportunity for Jesus to elevate one of the disciples above the rest. I think that's what they wanted. I think maybe they're all thinking, some of them have longer odds than others to be being called the greatest. But they're all thinking, maybe Jesus will pick me. And that's why they're arguing. I would just wonder what those arguments were like, don't you? It sounds to me like it's probably like little kids. Like, no, I'm the best. No, I'm the best. But they want Jesus to rule on it, and Jesus instead takes a little child. Children were disdained in the ancient world. We'll pay attention to kids. We'll care about this when you're older. But as you are now, seen and not heard. Okay, get out of the way. In fact, the disciples do that when some bring their children to him, and they say, no, get out of here. We don't have time for kids. And Jesus invites the children and gets mad at the disciples who try to stop them. That'll be in chapter 19. So he invites a little child and says, be like this child. All right, then we have a series of sayings, verse 5 and 6, talking about receiving children and not causing them to sin. I'm not sure we're talking about children anymore, but maybe young disciples, little ones who believe in me, he says in verse 6. And then he kind of goes on a little riff about sin in general and temptations to sin or offenses or stumbling blocks in verse 7 down to verse 9. So there are some things or some people that are going to lead us to sin, and Jesus has a very no-nonsense view of that. If your eye causes you to sin, tear it out. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. We've already been through that. He's already said this back in chapter 5. in the context of the Sermon on the Mount. And now he's saying it again in the context of the community. If it's going to cause me to sin or it's going to cause you to sin, I need to get rid of it. All right, verse 15, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. If he does not listen, take 1 or 2 others with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. All right, so significant here is that if we have a problem between each other, and he's talking about his disciples, go tell him his fault between you and him alone. This is the part that we really struggle with. We really struggle with going and actually talking to the person that has sinned against us. Sometimes we blame it on them. They sinned against me. They need to come talk to me, all of that. This is about resolving a conflict directly. And Jesus has a process here about how to avoid all the offenses and the stumbling blocks that we've just been talking about. If we just will talk to each other about a problem, very often we resolve the conflict. In fact, very often in my experience, we had misunderstood the conflict. And clarity comes when we sit down and actually look each other in the eye. But there's a process if a person is sort of recalcitrant, rebellious, unwilling to change, unwilling to stop doing what's wrong. And then Peter hears that, and the only thing he hears is, if he hears you, you've gained your brother, which means you're going to have to get rid of worrying about it. You're going to have to forgive people. And so that's what he hears. He seizes on that and says, well, how often do we have to do that? And then that leads into the story of the unforgiving servant in that last section of chapter 18. Okay. We're in the last 5 minutes. We're actually in the last 4 minutes. So what have we learned first about Jesus? All right. So first, Jesus is the Messiah and God's Son. That's the confession that Peter makes. And Jesus says, blessed are you. This has come from God and not from man. He wants to build a people whom death can't touch. This is part of Jesus' mission and why he came, to collect that people, to unite them by faith in him, and then to preserve them through death. So that's you and me. And we are now a part of a people that death can't touch. The gates of Hades shall not prevail against them. He is God's spokesman. So on the Mount of Transfiguration, God says, how much more emphatically can God say, this is the one I want you to listen to. This is my son, hear him. Despite his status, though, if you think about all of these things, despite his status, he urges and demonstrates humility. He wants to have a humble people. And he says the mascot of the kingdom of God is a little child. This is what you need to be like. Be humble. And he consistently pushes his disciples toward that. They struggle with that. We all struggle with that. Because it is as if we need to become different, new people, born again, transformed, so that we can be converted and become like little children. And then this last part that we didn't get to, he expects his disciples to pay his grace forward. When God forgives this astronomical debt, he expects us then to forgive each other and to look at each other and say, what you've done to me is small potatoes compared to what I've done to God. And I can let go because that's what Jesus wants us to do. So we've learned that about Jesus. What have we learned about ourselves? We often don't learn lessons the first time. Have you noticed that about yourself? It takes some repetition. I get frustrated with myself when there are lessons that I should have learned from past experiences that were sort of drilled into me, and then I end up doing the same dumb thing again. And you kind of look in the mirror and say, how many times do I have to go through this before I get it? The disciples are like that. Don't you yet understand? How can you not get this? I think we need to think about the humility that is involved in learning that says, you know what, I need to grow in this. I need to do better in this. I've got work to do. Instead of saying, everything's fine, I'm fine, as long as God would just take this circumstance out of the way or just help me figure out this relationship problem, then everything would be fine. Maybe these things are showing a deficiency in us that we need to learn from. Being right in one situation doesn't guarantee we're right in others. I'm thinking about Peter. Boy, he's right about Jesus being the Messiah. Boy, he's wrong about what that's going to mean. I think we think of being right as sort of this just who we are. And I may mess up in this, but I'm right in this. And sometimes if we work through something and we say, okay, now I'm confident that I'm right about this topic, this issue, this relational problem, whatever it is, I'm right. Then we sort of think that transfers to everything else we do and think, as if right is just sort of a state we're in. Peter shows us you could be really wrong even if you're right. And in fact, sometimes that initial right can lead to pride in us. We only need a little faith to do great things. I love the fact that he talks about it as faith like a grain of mustard seed that enables us to move mountains. Jesus uses this dramatic language to say it's not about you and what you are doing. It's about the God you connect to. And if you can just believe in him a little, he can do amazing things. And then we must talk directly with and learn to forgive our brother. I just cannot tell you how many times I have talked to people about personal issues with other people, and they will not. I don't mean they haven't. I don't mean they can't. They will not talk to others about it. When Jesus says, go talk to your brother. It's maybe a little intimidating, but I'll assure you it's much more effective in actually dealing with the problem. I know Michael's been waiting on me. 3 questions. What kinds of people are influencing me right now? I want you to think about that question when you think about how Peter had these things revealed to him and what the disciples are thinking, what Jesus warns about the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Who's influencing me? Right now, someone is influencing you. Who is it? What situations in my life am I unequal to? Because the disciples have several of them in this section. And I think we notice their failures and how they can get help from Jesus about it. And then who, or it might be whom, for all you English teachers out there, who do I need to forgive? Is there someone that I know I have something against that Jesus is calling on me to be better about that situation and forgive them? All right, thanks so much for your attention. We'll pick up.